Good evening. Tonight I'm going to talk about FDR and the shadow of war. Americans in the 1930s tried to turn their backs on the world's problems. The only battle FDR sought was against the Depression. But as the clouds of war gathered over Europe, Roosevelt eventually concluded that the U.S. could no longer remain aloof from world events. And events gradually brought the American people round to his thinking. No nation was safe in an era of international anarchy. The London Economic Conference of 1933 was called as an agreement to stabilize national currencies that might exchange stabilization was essential for the revival of world trade that had disappeared by 1933. FDR torpedoed the London Economic Conference of 1933 when he announced, after saying that he would send a delegation to the conference, that he was going to withdraw them. He did this because he wanted to concentrate primarily on the recovery of the American domestic economy. He undermined this conference because any agreement to stabilize national currencies might hurt America's recovery from depression. But as a result of FDR's withdrawal from the London Conference, the trend towards extreme nationalism was strengthened, and the London Economic Conference revealed how thoroughly FDR's only early foreign policy was subordinated to his strategy for domestic economic recovery. And FDR's refusal to support international economic cooperation in the 1930s will deepen the worldwide depression and aid the rise of fascist dictators and extreme nationalism. Seeking to withdraw from the overseas commitments and colonial expense, the United States in 1934 promised future independence to the Philippines in 12 years. In promising to grant the Philippines independence, the United States was motivated only by the realization that the islands were economic liabilities. The one internationalist action by FDR in his first term in office was the formal recognition of the Soviet Union. And FDR's recognition of the Soviet Union was undertaken partly in hope of developing a diplomatic counterweight to the rising power of Japan, who lay to the east of the Soviet Union, and Germany, who lay to the west. FDR's good neighbor policy toward Latin America included a renunciation of American intervention in Mexico or elsewhere in the region. As part of his good neighbor policy towards Latin America, FDR withdrew American Marines from Haiti. FDR's good neighbor policy brought new respect for the United States and for democracy in Latin America, and FDR will be one of the most highly esteemed Americans in the Latin American community. But the reason why he did this is that why he embarked on the good neighbor policy was in part because he was eager to enlist Latin American allies to defend the Western Hemisphere against European and Asian dictators. So as part of his plan to concentrate on alleviating the depression at home, FDR's administration extended formal diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union, promised independence to the Philippines, and abandoned the interventionist policy towards Latin America. But the net effect of most of FDR's early foreign policy moves was that the United States was giving up ambitions to be a world power and concentrating on the Western Hemisphere. But one of the great actions of FDR's first presidency will be the 1930 Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act that increased Americans' foreign trade and it will cause tariffs to lower and trade to rise. Throughout most of the 1930s, the American people responded to the aggressive actions of Germany, Italy, and Japan by retreating further into isolationism. The immediate response of most Americans to the rise of the fascist dictators Mussolini and Hitler was a deeper commitment to remain isolated from European problems. American isolationism was caused partly by a deep disillusionment with U.S. participation in World War I, and bad memories of World War I and revelations from arms merchants promoted U.S. isolationism and the passage of several neutrality acts in the mid 1930s. Fascist aggression in the 1930s included Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. After Hitler had invaded the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland in 1936, he will then invade Czechoslovakia in 1939 after he had been given the Sudetenland at the Munich Conference in the fall of 1938. And another fascist aggression will be Franco's overthrow of the Republican government of Spain in the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939 that will end in the fascist victory led by Franco. By the mid-1930s, there was strong nationwide agitation for a constitutional amendment to forbid a declaration of war by Congress unless first approved by a nationwide referendum. This is how deep Americans believe that they should stay out of world events because of the results of World War I. The Neutrality Acts of 1935, 1936, and 1937 essentially required that no Americans could sail on belligerent ships, that means ships of nations at war, sell munitions, or make loans to nations at war. The Neutrality Acts of the mid-1930s prevented Americans from lending money or selling weapons to warring nations and from sailing on belligerent ships. The passage of the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 1936, 1937 had four consequences. It resulted in the abandonment of the traditional policy of freedom of the seas, a decline in the Navy and other armed forces. It made no distinction whatever between aggressors and victims, and it will spur and encourage aggressors along their path of conquest. So the U.S. Neutrality Acts of the mid-1930s actually aided fascist dictators in carrying out their aggression in Ethiopia, Spain, and China. So Americans' fervent isolationism in the 1930s can best be attributed to their regrets about participating in World War I, the bitter memories of the ungrateful nations that defaulted on their World War I debts, and the totalizing impact of the Great Depression and the need to focus on getting out of it. So from 1925 to 1940, the transition of American policy on arms sales to warring nations followed the sequence of embargo to cash and carry to lend-lease. The United States will adhere to the neutrality laws and refused to help the Loyalist government in its civil war against Franco and his fascist forces. America's neutrality policy, along with that of France and Britain during the Spanish Civil War of 1936-1939, did nothing to prevent Spain from becoming a fascist dictatorship after Franco's victory. The effect of the strict American arms embargo during the Civil War between the Loyalist Spanish government and Franco's fascist rebels was to cripple the Loyalist government, while Mussolini and Hitler armed Franco in a rehearsal to all-out war. In fact, Stalin will be the only outside power to fund and aid the Spanish Loyalist government. In 1938, Hitler will announce that Germany desires the Sudetenland, which is the northern part of Czechoslovakia that borders Germany, because of the 1.5 million Germans, who live in that area of Czechoslovakia. So in September 1938 in Munich, Germany, Britain and France consented to Germany's taking the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. So in other words, the policy of appeasing the fascist dictators reached its low point in 1938 when Britain and France sold out Czechoslovakia to Hitler in the Munich Conference. The irony of the Munich Conference is that one, Czechoslovakia was an ally to both France and Britain, and two, Czechoslovakia was kept out of the negotiations. And our part in the appeasement policy is that the United States did not object to the appeasement policy of the Western democracies in reaction to Hitler's aggressive demands. In fact, the U.S. endorsed it. In March 1939, soon after he has occupied the Sudetenland, Hitler and the German army will basically march into the rest of Czechoslovakia in March of 1939 and conquer and seize Czechoslovakia without a shot being fired. But then, because of that act, public opinion and government action will change in both Britain and France, and both now realize they have to prepare for war. But the one thing that is preventing Hitler from beginning an all-out war in Europe is the policy of a two-front war that had plagued Germany during World War I and ultimately led to its defeat. So in August of 1939, the two enemies who hated each other, communism and fascism, they will sign a Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact in which the Soviet Union and Germany both agree not to invade each other and basically agree quietly that both will invade Poland, and this will begin World War II. So shortly after Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, Germany will invade Poland on September 1st, 1939 and start World War II. France and Britain, because of alliance requirements or obligations, they will declare war on Germany soon after, and the Soviet Union and Stalin will be caught off guard, and they will have to quickly rebound to try to get their part of Poland. As a result of the outbreak of World War II in Europe, as a result of Hitler's invasion of Poland, the United States will pass the Cash and Carry Neutrality Act of 1939 that was cleverly designed to help Britain and France by letting them buy supplies and munitions in the United States as long as they paid cash and they carried them on their own ships. There would be no U.S. loans and no U.S. ships involved. So soon after the 1-month conquest of Poland by Germany and then the Soviet Union, war will turn into a phony war, Sitzkrieg. And from September 1939 to June 1940, Hitler will conquer first Poland, and then in the spring of 1940, he will turn his eyes towards Norway and Denmark to protect his right flank. And then in May of 1940, Germany will attack both Netherlands and France. And by the end of June, France has fallen to the German army. So what Germany could not achieve in 4 years during World War I, it will achieve within 2 months at the beginning of 1940. So the fall of France caused the United States into enacting a conscription law, a peacetime conscription law in September 1940, and it will shake the Americans to the core and move them to make an enormous effort against Hitler's aggression in Europe after the fall of France. And within a year, Congress will appropriate $37 billion to build huge air fleets and a two-ocean navy. And $37 billion will be more than the total cost of World War I, and it will be 5 times larger than any New Deal annual budget. And the reality is the government's deficit will rise greatly as a result of World War II, not the New Deal. Another issue that will come to the forefront in American politics will be the issue of refugees from Germany. Probably the greatest obstacle to Americans' acceptance of more Jewish refugees from Europe was that they did not believe that the Nazis were carrying out a systematic mass killing, industrial killing of Jews, not only in Germany, where there were only 500,000, but Jews all over Europe. It will begin in November 1938 with Kristallnacht, which is the night of the broken glass. It will see Jewish businesses and synagogues attacked and destroyed. 30,000 Jews will be immediately sent to concentration camps. And this will help turn the tide of American public opinion towards Nazism and Hitler. But by 1942, with the growing news about the Holocaust, or what the Nazis called the final solution, the United States and FDR will establish the War Refugee Board. It will save thousands of Hungarian Jews from deportation to the death camp at Auschwitz, but it will only save about 150,000 Jews, mostly Germans and Austrians, who will come to the United States. Before the outbreak of war, many German Jews will flee Germany, but because of our restrictive immigration laws and the hostility of the State Department and Southern Democrats, this will prevent FDR in the U.S. from admitting many Jewish refugees from Nazism into the United States before the outbreak of war. And probably the most infamous case is the passenger ship St. Louis, who will basically leave Germany in May of 1939 with 937 passengers, almost all of them Jewish refugees. It will first sail to Havana, where they will be denied entry for the lack of a valid Cuban visa, and then they will sail to Miami, which proved no more hospitable, and FDR will briefly show some interest in accepting the beleaguered passengers, but restrictive immigration laws, together with the opposition from Southern Democrats and the State Department, convinced him otherwise. The St. Louis will be turned away one last time in Canada, and St. Louis will eventually deposit its passengers in England, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, where many of them will subsequently perish in the Holocaust, in Nazi death camps, because France, Belgium, and the Netherlands will all be under German rule for most of World War II. So efforts to bring large numbers of Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany to the United States were largely blocked by restrictive immigration laws and opposition from Southern Democrats and the State Department. After the fall of France in the summer and fall of 1940, Hitler in Germany and the German Luftwaffe will begin the first fully air battle in military history called the Battle of Britain. And this will lead to two actions. This will be the destroyers for base deal of 1940 that provided that the United States would give Britain 50 American destroyers in exchange for 8 valuable naval bases in the Western Hemisphere. And this will basically precipitate a change or reversal of American policy from neutrality to active, though non belligerent, support for the Allied cause as a result of the fall of France and the Battle of Britain. And by the fall of 1940, a strong majority of American public opinion had come to favor providing Britain with all aid short of war. But this debate will intensify, and America will be divided between interventionists or isolationists. And isolationists were both numerous and sincere, and the America First Committee, whose most effective speechmaker will be Charles A. Lindbergh, were basically adamantly opposed to U.S. entry in the war, and they believed that the Americans should concentrate strength to defend their own shores. But FDR and a growing number of Americans realized that if Hitler took Britain, then there would be no stopping Hitler and Germany from crossing the Atlantic and threatening the United States. In the election of 1940, FDR will give up the tradition of two consecutive terms, and he was motivated to run for a third term in 1940, mainly by his belief that America needed his experienced leadership during this time of international crisis. In 1940, Republican presidential candidate Wendell Willkie avoided deepening the sharp divisions among the American people when he avoided attacking FDR for his increasingly interventionist policies. And compared to FDR's two previous Republican opponents, Herbert Hoover and Alfred Landon, his 1940 opponent Wendell Willkie will run a strong race on positive reformist platform. But in March 1941, soon after FDR will take the oath of office for the third time, the Lend-Lease Act will be passed by the U.S. Congress. It will clearly mark the end to the pretense of American neutrality between Britain and Germany, and it is the beginning of naval clashes with Germany in the North Atlantic. The 1941 Lend-Lease program had 4 traits or characteristics. It will see an intense debate between internationalists and isolationists. It was a direct challenge to the Axis dictators. It's the point when all pretense of American neutrality was abandoned, and it will be the catalyst that caused American factories to prepare and retool for all-out war production. And in May 1941, German U-boats will sink the Robin Moore outside a war zone. And after the Greer was fired upon in September 1941, and the Carney was crippled in October 1941, and later on the Reuben James was sunk in late October 1941, Congress will allow the arming of the United States merchant vessels and the beginning of convoy of Lend-Lease shipments across the Atlantic that will thrust the United States into an undeclared naval war with Nazi Germany in the North Atlantic before Pearl Harbor. But in June of 1941, after he had failed in his attempt to invade and conquer Britain in the Battle of Britain, Hitler will turn his attention towards the Soviet Union and he will launch Operation Barbarossa. And in response to Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, FDR and Churchill will meet secretly off the coast of Newfoundland and they will issue a public policy. The Atlantic Charter had 8 points. Its main provisions included self-determination for oppressed peoples, a new international peacekeeping organization, collective security, disarmament, and it basically stated that all peoples of the world should have freedom from fear and want. By 1941, Japan believed that it had no alternative to war with the United States because FDR absolutely insisted that Japan withdrew from China. The U.S. embargo of oil and other supplies to Japan in mid-1941, after the Japanese had occupied northern Indochina, will force Japan to either accept U.S. demands regarding China or go to war. This will directly lead to Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 came as a great surprise because FDR and the U.S. government suspected that if an attack came, it would be in Malaya or the Philippines. And even though we have basically decoded the Japanese diplomatic code with Enigma, because of interference in the atmosphere, we cannot send a warning of a possible attack to Pearl Harbor until the attack had begun. And on the eve of Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, a large majority of Americans still wanted to keep the U.S. out of the war. The Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 will result in 3,000 casualties, the destruction of 8 U.S. battleships, naval battleships, but it will fail in 2 ways. It will fail to destroy the 3 U.S. aircraft carriers who were not at Pearl Harbor at the time of the attack, and it will not destroy the oil reserves on the islands of Hawaii. And probably the greatest legacy of the surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor is that it will create a strong sense of American national unity during World War II, and by December 11, 1941, we are at war not only in the Pacific against Japan, but we are also at war against Italy and Germany in Europe.